All right, so if you guys remember from 2 weeks ago, we had 2 points. Well, I didn't really talk about 7 points. My main thing was really focusing on point 6. That's where we're going to be spending the vast majority of our time tonight, because I think point 7 is going to be, I'm talking to a group of Christians, okay? So I don't have to really sell you on point 7. Point 6 is the one we're really going to spend a whole lot of time on. Let me go ahead and explain what I'm saying. Point 6 is the New Testament is historically reliable. Point 7 is the New Testament says Jesus claimed to be God. When I'm talking about point 6 and point 7, I'm doing this in relation to our apologetic outline. You guys have it on your Band app if you want to look through it. The ones before this had to do with miracles that Coy addressed, and the first 3 had a whole lot to do with truth, and truth about reality can be known. The opposite of true is false, and that a theistic God exists. And then 4 and 5 were about miracles. And then point 6 we're talking about the New Testament being historically reliable. Point 7, the New Testament says Jesus claimed to be God. Now I'm going to spend more time on point 6 than on point 7 because, like I said, I'm speaking to a group of Christians. I shouldn't have to spend a whole lot of time telling you guys that Jesus claimed to be God, right? I should be able to throw some scripture at you, and you guys are like, oh yeah, he did, and you pretty much already know it, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that. But when it comes, not yet, but when it comes time to witness to somebody, you may have to spend more time on the New Testament that says Jesus claimed to be God than what I will with you guys, right? But what really matters to you all is, how do you know that the New Testament is historically reliable? I mean, point 1 was all about truth, right? And how we know truth. And what we looked at was how there is an attack on truth today. Well, along with the attack on truth, obviously if there's an attack on truth, there's going to be an attack on God's Word, right? There's going to be an attack right there. Last time, if you guys remember, I asked you guys, have you guys ever heard of a man named Bart Ehrman? Or Bart Ehrman, all right? And he's very famous. I mean, he's been on Jon Stewart. He's been on Stephen Colbert. He's got New York Times best-selling books. I can't remember. I know one of them off the top of my head is called Misquoting Jesus, right? That's probably one of his most famous books was Misquoting Jesus. And I started you guys out with one of the quotes from last time was, what if the New Testament contained not Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, but the Gnostic teachings Jesus delivered to his disciples after his resurrection? What if it contained not the letters of Paul and Peter, but the letters of Ptolemy and Barnabas? What if it continued not the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but the Gospel of Thomas, Philip, Mary, and Nicodemus? He made statements like that, and he's a professor. Last time I heard, he was a professor at UNC, and he's head of one of the heads of the religious department over there. Okay? All right, so if we're looking at point 6, whether or not the New Testament is historically reliable, you guys remember last time I asked you guys what are some of the greatest challenges to not only I think I put in the question validity of the New Testament, but realistically I should have put reliability of the New Testament. But we're going to look at both of those tonight, the reliability and the validity. And if there was any if I need to clarify there, I'll clarify again, because I think it's going to come out real quick. So in order to prove that the New Testament is historically reliable, we got to answer 2 questions. All right? 2 questions. Do we have accurate copies of original documents that were written down in the 1st century? Do we have accurate copies of original documents that were written down in the 1st century? Okay? We're going to prove that the New Testament is historically reliable. We got to answer that question. Because the question I posed to you guys a couple weeks ago in our breakout groups was, and I think we addressed it again later on, was, all right, so you can quote John to me all day long, but Timothy, how do you know that John wrote John? How do you know that Paul wrote Romans? How do you know that Peter wrote 1 Peter? Right? How do we know those things? How do we know that what's in there was what, even if they wrote it, how do we even know that that's what they originally wrote? How do you know it wasn't changed? Dude, it was written 2,000 years ago. You're going to tell me that it's held up 2,000 years later? That's what's going to be thrown at you. Okay? Close a close personal friend of mine, about a decade ago, grew up in church. Actually, went to the church right down here on the Parkway for a long time, and even attended our church at one point. One of his greatest struggles was, well, how do I know that the Catholic Church didn't change what was originally written? That was one of his greatest fears. Okay? That was one of his doubts. I mean, of course, that doubt's only been perpetuated even farther and farther and farther because of things in the media. I mean, I don't know if you guys know about this, but I know about this because of high school and college days. But when we saw The Passion of the Christ released in 2003, I believe it was my junior year in high school, it wasn't very long after. Do you guys know what movie came out? The Da Vinci Code. The Da Vinci Code, which was from a best-selling author by a guy by the name of Dan Brown. And it very much was questioning the reliability and the validity of the New Testament, and that there was some higher order people that were in power, and there was a big conspiracy that people were changing words in the text, right? So how do we know the New Testament is really reliable? So that's the first question that we got to ask. The second question we got to ask, by the way, question number one has to do with reliability. Y'all good with that? Question number two, did those documents speak the truth? That's validity. Okay? First question, do we have accurate copies of original documents that were written down in the first century? That is reliability. Second question, okay, but do those documents speak the truth? That's validity. That's what we're talking about. All right, so first off, what we got to address, if you noticed in that question, I said, do we have accurate copies of original? Notice what I didn't even, I just skipped right over. We don't have originals. Okay? As of right now. I'm not going to say that it'll never ever happen. Highly unlikely. All right? But we don't have originals. But keep in mind, it wasn't like they wrote it in a 5-star notebook. Okay? Obviously they didn't type it, right? But they used papyrus, and it would be rolled up, and it would be placed in a leather pouch. That stuff's going to wear down over time. Have you guys ever seen letters from even the Civil War era? Have you ever seen how they're barely hanging on? And that was from the 1800s, right? That was from not even 200 years ago. Imagine 2,000 years ago. It's not going to hold up. Plus, there are other reasons why that we'll look into later. All right? So we don't have the original copy, but here's the thing that we need to realize is we don't have the original copy of any work of antiquity. Now, the word, when I say antiquity, I want you guys to know what I mean. I mean ancient. It means ancient, meaning the beginning of human history to about 400 to 450 AD. So those are considered to be works of antiquity. So if you hear me say that, just know, old stuff. All right? Not the Middle Ages. All right? Not quite the Middle Ages. All right? So what all does that mean? What all does that imply? Well, that means that we don't have an original copy for Homer's Iliad. If you guys ever had to read that in high school or college. Homer's The Odyssey. If you ever had to read that in high school or college. Fun fact about Homer's Odyssey. The movie Oh Brother Where Art Thou is loosely based on Homer's The Odyssey. Yeah. Mind blown. Yeah. All right, so then Tacitus, I had to ask because I joke with Tessa and Cassie. Tessa and Cassie are kind of my check of, am I stupid? Because if I ask them a question and they don't know the answer, then I know, oh, I'm not stupid. Because I didn't know who Tacitus was, and I asked them if they knew, they didn't know, so then I was like, okay, I'm not stupid. All right, so Tacitus, Annals of Imperial Rome. Annals of Imperial Rome. We don't have the original copy for that. We don't have the original copy for Pliny's Natural History of Rome. We don't have the original copies of Julius Caesar's recording of the Gallic Wars. We don't have the original copies for Plato's The Republic. Okay? And of course, we don't have the original copies for the New Testament. So what we need to do is we need to keep in mind, if we're going to hold the New Testament to the same criteria of all of these works, we need to see how what? How does the New Testament measure up with all the other things that I just said that you probably zoned out when I was saying it? Okay? How does the New Testament measure up with Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey? How does it measure up with Tacitus' Annals of Imperial Rome? How does it measure up with Pliny's Natural History of Rome? How does it measure up with Julius Caesar's recording of the Gallic Wars or Plato's The Republic? How does it measure up to those works of antiquity? Right? So, just so you know, I want to give you something else I think that's kind of cool to point out to you, okay? I'm really drawing out all these other works of antiquity for a reason. All right? Plato and another philosopher whose name I can't pronounce, and I'm not going to try here. So Plato and another philosopher are the only resources that we have of another great philosopher by the name of, you ever heard of Socrates? Okay? Well, the only way that we know about Socrates is from his students, his followers. Kind of getting a picture that I'm painting here. All right? So, we wouldn't even know who Socrates was if it wasn't for Plato and this other guy's name I can't pronounce, but mainly Plato. Okay, and technically Aristotle, but just so you know, and this will I could also draw a parallel here as well. Aristotle was a student of Plato, who was a student of Socrates. Follow me for just a minute. Jesus, and then his students, and then his students. You following my imaginary diagrams here? Thank you. All right, so we wouldn't even know who Socrates was if it wasn't for Plato and this other guy. So another piece of information that might be helpful to know before we look at comparing the New Testament to these other works is that pretty much all we know about Roman history is found in some of these works. All right? If we want to know about Roman history, we're going to read Tacitus. Like, when I teach my kids about ancient Rome, when I pull up a brain pop, anybody ever heard of brain pop? Oh, Tim and Moby, right? When I pull up a brain pop video about ancient Rome and I show that, where did Tim and Moby get that from? Where did the people who create brain pop get that from? They got that from the people that I just mentioned to you. So now what does that mean? That means that we accept all those other works that I just mentioned as fact, as history. So now I'm going to take those and compare them to the New Testament. Okay? Do you understand why I spent a lot of time talking about all these other things? All right? It's important because when people come to you and they start throwing out all these other things at you, it's like, okay, well then I need to take a step back for a minute and be like, okay, well if you're going to believe any history, well then, all right. So, realistically, if you want to look into, like I said, into history that predates even these works, like ancient Egyptians, Chinese, or Mesopotamians, we would have to look back even farther. Needless to say, guess what? We don't have any original copies of those documents either. So what we have for all of these literary works is copies. Now these copies are referred to as manuscripts. Okay? Now, hate to break it to you, underneath that first question that I asked y'all earlier about the reliability of the New Testament being historically reliable, there are going to be two things that we have to look at. So what that means is, if we're going to compare how the New Testament measures up to all these other works, we're going to have to understand the criteria. What is the criteria? Well, the criteria by which we use to measure up the reliability of these works are two main ways that measure the accuracy of the manuscripts. Number one is the number of manuscript copies in existence. How many copies do we have? Right? Pretty simple. Number two, and this one is actually almost as important, if not more important than number one. Okay? It's pretty important. The time interval. The time interval between the original and the copies. Okay? So, I mean, that's kind of a big deal between like when we had our original and the next copy that we find, because if the original was in like, let's use 45 AD, okay, Why do I use 45 AD? Because 45 AD was around the time of, 45 to 50 AD was around the time of the first New Testament work, which is the book of James, widely believed to be the book of James. All right? Between 45 to 50 AD, and you look at it and you say, okay, well, what if we don't have our first copy till 1,000 years from now? Yikes. That would kind of be troubling, wouldn't it? Tessa, I'm going to need you. So, with that being said, I got you guys a graphic. Cassie, you can send it.
Tessa, I like your hair.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just thought that.
It's a perfect time. It's a perfect time to say it. It's not like I'm in the middle of saying anything.
So Natalie and I were talking about while you were teaching, and so the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff like that, were those original copies of the Old Testament, or were those manuscripts of the Old Testament?
They're like the earliest manuscripts.
Yes, and they have Old Testament as well, because you have Isaiah in there.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
that's
it's
what
like the 12 prophets.
that's what I was asking.
Yes.
Is that because
I don't think they have any of
if they were Old Testament ones,
of the New Testament, right?
They were mostly Isaiah.
They were mostly Isaiah.
Isaiah is a chunky book.
But nonetheless. it's-
Yeah, but Isaiah, like we pointed out when we were reading Acts, right? Isaiah is probably one of the best ones to get.
I'm
Yeah.
excited to read Isaiah.
There's a lot
But
of
it's also
prophecies
a lot.
about Jesus' coming, so the fact that they clearly stated that they were.
All right, so this, which you're going to see it up here, but you're also going to see it on your phones, right?
Yeah.
All right, so if you look right here, all right, if I had a dry erase board, I'd show it to you. But follow my finger right now. Is my computer in your way?
Yeah, very much.
Okay, I'm sorry. Here, watch this. All right, so that dot right there is what we're going to call the point of origin. The point of origin. And it kind of looks like it's like a solar system, and there's like a bunch of planets out here, but they're all like suns and mini suns, right? Do you see all that? So this is the point of origin. This is how far out a lot of these works of antiquity are. So like if you look, for example, I mentioned to you guys Aristotle, right? I mentioned to you guys Aristotle. Aristotle, we had Socrates, and Socrates' student was Plato, and Plato's student was Aristotle, right? Okay, and then over here, I mentioned to you guys, there's Plato, right? Plato is right here, okay? Now you guys can't really see that very well, but you probably could on your phone, because it's on the Band app right now on your phone. So that right there is 1,400 years from the point of origin. So here's your point of origin. Here's Plato. Our first copy of Plato, all right, our first manuscript from the point of origin is 1,400 years. 1,400 years. All right? So as far as time interval, 1,400 years is a lot of time, isn't it? How many copies do we have? 7. We have 7 copies. Cool story. Tacitus. Remember I told you guys, where do we get most of our ancient Roman history from? People like Pliny and people like Tacitus. All right? Tacitus, which you can't see there, but you might see on your phone better, is about 1,000 years. 1,000 years. And how many, that's the time interval, it's about 1,000 years. Well, how many copies do we have of Tacitus' Annals of Rome? 20. Okay? All right. Now, Caesar, Julius Caesar, that looks like it's going to be around 1,000 as well. Julius Caesar is exactly 1,000 years is our time interval from its point of origin right there. And how many copies do we have of that? 10. So the second best in terms of time interval and the number of copies, the number of manuscripts, is Homer's Iliad. Homer's Iliad. Okay? And you're looking at about 500 years from the point of origin. 500 years from the point of origin. And how many copies do you have? Now, all the other copies that I mentioned to you, the most I saw was like, what, 10? I think Aristotle has 49. Homer has 643 copies. That's why it's so big in comparison to these. But that's the New Testament. That's the New Testament. And how big the circle is represents how many manuscripts that we have. And how close the circle is to the point of origin gives us our time interval. All right, according to this graph, our time interval from the point of origin is less than a century. It's 40 to 70 years. Second place, Homer's Iliad was 500 years. And the point of origin that we have for the New Testament is anywhere from 40 to 70. Some people want to date it is like all the way to like 25 to 40 years. It kind of gets wishy-washy depending on how people date the book of John, date the Gospel of John, and also depending on when you date certain fragments, which we'll talk about later as well. So what does all of this mean? So here's what I'll show you is the existing copies and Jersey Girls. I'll get you guys this. If not on the band app, then I'll just send it to Sam. You can just copy it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All right,
okay.
you got it.
All right, thank you, sir. All right, so New Testament, existing copies, how many do we have? All right, remember I told you Homer was 600 and, does that say 43 or 63? Homer 643. New Testament, we have over 24,000 copies. Over 24,000. There's not even a comparison. There's not even a comparison. If we're going to compare it to what's our very first criteria, the number of manuscript copies in existence. 24,000 compared to second place, 643. Now, why do I think that is so ridiculous? Because we read the Homer's Iliad in high school and college, and it's like, well, that's what Homer wrote. There's not even a question. There's not even a debate. Why? Why? I mean, I'm not going to debate that as long as they don't debate the New Testament.
I find it interesting because, like I took a philosophy class last semester, and we read supposedly their writing in in the book of a bunch of the people on this board. I've read excerpts from it and stuff that was it's said to be exactly what they wrote.
And I'm not going to say that I don't believe that it is. I'm just saying that this is even more reliable than these.
How do things like the Quran compare to the New Testament in terms of
Quran was written in the Middle Ages, first of all.
Yeah.
And secondly, and this is what's going to get tricky, it went to where there was only one line of transmission. One line of transmission. You may say, man, that's safe. That's great. But if there's only one line of transmission, how easy is it to corrupt? Very easy to corrupt. Whereas when you have 24,000 manuscripts, a lot less likely, in all kinds of different countries and places, a lot less likely to corrupt.
Just to be on the safe side, especially because of the verbal record, can you clarify what you mean by one line of transmission?
All right. So basically, it's in control of one line. It's in control of one place. It's not like, okay, so for example, I mentioned to you guys earlier about how we were kind of, the Dan Brown Da Vinci Code, it was kind of worried, kind of scared about whether or not that it had been corrupted and controlled by the Catholic Church, right? Well, with the Quran, it only had that one line of transmission, whereas there came to a point when it was originally written around, I want to say it was 600. I think I read it, but I was reading so much that I can't really tell you for an absolute fact. Written in the Middle Ages, and it was basically following just one line. It was always just one group of people in control of it.
So if somebody changed something, it would be could
super easy.
erased. Yeah.
I'm not saying that
It contradicted it.
that happened,
Yeah.
okay? Because
That's just an interesting.
yes,
So it was since there were so many copies of manuscripts of the New Testament circulating where like that even if someone did change something, then you would find contradictions in other manuscripts that were found, right? Like as opposed to if just one like group of people were in control over it, they could change something and no one would know the difference.
Very good. So let's go back to the word that he used right there. Did y'all follow that? He said contradictions. So instead of using the word contradiction, I'm going to use the word variance. Now, if you guys remember, we talked about this a couple weeks ago when I told you that there were more variances in the New Testament than there were words. Do you guys remember when I said that? I pointed that out. There were more variances in the New Testament than there are words. And if you look down at the bottom of some of your Bibles, I don't know if all your Bibles do that, but I know my Bibles do, it'll say some manuscripts say. Some manuscripts say. There's a lot of them. There was like 2 or 3 on one page of mine, which we're going there. I don't want to get too far ahead, but I will come back to the whole variance issue. All right. So as far as the more manuscripts is concerned, there's a guy named F.E. Peters. He's a former professor of emeritus of history, religion, and Islamic studies at NYU, and he states that. Funny that, this is a guy I didn't look to see if he was a Christian or not, but the fact that he's a former professor of history in religion and Islamic studies in NYU, I don't really know if he's a Christian or not, but he says that on the basis of manuscript tradition alone, the works that made up the Christians' New Testament were the most frequently copied and widely circulated books of antiquity. And even though we have no original copies, the abundance of manuscript copies makes it possible to reconstruct the original with virtually complete accuracy. And the number of manuscripts, along with the short time interval between the original and the first copies, should eliminate the skeptical argument of the telephone game, right? We're talking about the whole 2,000 years thing. It just keeps on passing down. It's changing a little bit, and a little bit more, 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 right? Fortunately, the New Testament wasn't transmitted that way, since it was not told to one person who told it to another, and so on. The problem from the telephone game doesn't really apply. And numerous people independently witnessed New Testament events. Many of them committed it to memory, and none of those eyewitnesses and contemporaries put their observations into writings. So, again, if you want to compare this back to Islam, all right, well, where do we get the Quran primarily from? Who wrote the New Testament? Give me a name. Throw out a name for the New Testament. Paul. Give me another one. James. Thought I was going to say John. Matthew. Peter. Luke. Thank you for mentioning Luke because his details are the best. As far as the details, the nitty-gritty details of everything, you said Mark. Okay, Jude. Right?
Revelation.
That's John. We're leaving. All right, so okay, now go this. Where do we get the Quran from? Thank you. That's it. We're done. We're done. Does that prove my point from earlier a little bit more? All right, so keep on going. Remember, the more manuscripts and the earlier manuscripts are what provides us with trustworthy testimonies. I know that I'm throwing a lot of information at you tonight, so just remember this. The more manuscripts and the earlier the manuscripts, the more reliable the work of antiquity is. All right? Plus, you just have this to access anytime you want on your phone. All right? So, the New Testament has plenty of that, and it measures up better than any other work of antiquity. If you don't consider the New Testament to be reliable, then you can't take any world or ancient history class seriously. We have more reliability for the New Testament than any ancient history class can provide. In fact, the New Testament has more manuscripts, earlier manuscripts, and more abundantly supported manuscripts than the best 10 pieces of classical literature combined. All right? Now, as far as the earlier manuscripts, and this is where you could go into oh my goodness, it was over my head. So if it was getting there, then I was like, there's no way I'm going to be able to teach this. So, with the earlier manuscripts, here's some interesting stuff that I found. As far as the earlier manuscripts are concerned, the earliest undisputed manuscript is a segment of John 18, 31 through 33, and 37 through 38. And it's known as the John Rylands Fragment because it's housed in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England. Okay? And then John 18:31, just so you guys can know what it says. It says, Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. The Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? So that's one of the earliest fragments that we have. And then 37 and 38. Remember what we begin with? Our very first point? What was our very first point for the apologetic outline? To know that truth is reliable, right? That truth about reality can be known. And you remember what we used? Let's read John 18:37, 38. Then Pilate said to him, so you are a king. Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Pilate said to him, what is truth? That's where we begin with the apologetic outline. Was truth about reality can be known. The earliest manuscript that we have, or not manuscript, but the earliest fragment, okay? Not manuscript, but the earliest fragment that we have of the New Testament are those verses that I just read to you. All right? Scholars date this manuscript between 117 to 138 AD. 117 to 138 AD. Some say even earlier. I heard one scholar date it all the way back to 95 AD, which is insanely far back, because when you start looking into when people believe that the Gospel of John was written, was dangerously close to what some people would date the Gospel of John being written. Now that's a later date for the Gospel of John, though. In any case, the Rylands fragment was found in Egypt across the Mediterranean, and its probable place of composition was in Asia Minor, showing that John's Gospel was copied and had spread quite some distances by the early 2nd century. The Rylands fragment gives the New Testament a time interval about 40 to 70 years, depending on when you date the Gospel of John, but it's, well, actually that's about 25 to 35 years, I think, depending on when you date John. It's a really short time interval. And if you compare that to the second shortest gap on our graph, Homer's Iliad has the next shortest gap at about 500 years. So how old are the oldest surviving manuscripts, okay, of the New Testament books? Now when I say the full manuscripts of the New Testament books, I'm asking you like, well, how old is the manuscript for like the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of John, not a fragment of John? Right? Because what I just told y'all about the Rylands fragment was just a fragment of John. It was just a few verses. Okay? And so manuscripts that are largely complete New Testament books survive from about 200 AD. What does that mean? That still puts it at around 100 to 150 years. Still way better than the 500 that we have for Homer's Iliad. Okay? How about the oldest manuscript containing the majority of the New Testament? That would be most of the New Testament, including all of the Gospels and the Pauline letters, James and 1 Peter, is about 250 AD. And then there is something called the Codex Vaticanus, which contains nearly all the New Testament with the exception of Revelation and I believe Philemon, and that survives from about 325 AD. But by 340 we have a complete verified manuscript with all the New Testament works, which is around 300 years from the first New Testament work, which is still better than the 500 that we have for Homer, with far more amount of manuscripts. Now, as far as there's the argument for more manuscripts, and there's the argument for an earlier manuscripts, but then there's also the argument that could be made for a more abundantly supported manuscript. Now, what do I mean by a more abundantly supported manuscript? All right, so what I mean by that is we have other mentionings of the New Testament other than just the manuscripts of the New Testament. You follow me? Okay, so just so you guys know, remember earlier when I told you guys that there probably would have been more copies? Like over 2,000 years, things erode. Paper doesn't last forever, especially the papyrus from way back then. Okay, so beginning in February of AD 303, there was a Roman emperor by the name of Diocletian, and he ordered 3 specific edicts of persecution upon Christians because he believed that the existence of Christianity was breaking the covenant between Rome and her gods. All right? The edicts called for 3 things: the destruction of churches, the killing of Christians, and the destroying of all manuscripts and books and literature that Christians used. All right? So, just so you know, hundreds if not thousands of manuscripts were destroyed across the Roman Empire during that time period. It was probably about a decade. However, I mentioned to you guys we have more abundantly supported manuscripts. What do I mean by more abundantly supported manuscripts? All right? Even if Diocletian had succeeded in destroying all the manuscripts of the New Testament, now that's a big if, all right? If the Roman emperor around AD 303 to about AD 310 destroyed all of our manuscripts, gone, all right? We would still be able to recreate the New Testament in its entirety. Now, when I say that, you should say, that makes no sense, Jamie. It's impossible. How's that possible? Well, I just told you. We have a more abundantly supported manuscript. So what do I mean by that? I mean that the early church fathers from AD 100 to AD 300, like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, and others, quoted the New Testament over 36,000 times in their works. All right? If you count all the early church fathers, there are some 1 million citations of the New Testament. And that makes reconstruction of the New Testament virtually certain. In fact, from those 1 million citations, we can recreate the New Testament in its entirety. Just from the quotations from the early church fathers, even if Diocletian had destroyed all of our manuscripts. So not only do we have the closest point of origin, not only do we have the most manuscripts, but we also have an abundance of support for our manuscripts thanks to our early church fathers who quoted them. And BT dubs, y'all know about this, that by this point, even when Diocletian was doing all this, the Bible had not been formed. It wasn't like the Bible, and when I say the Bible had not been formed, let me explain what I mean by that. Basically, what we consider the works of the Bible to be Scripture had not been put into the safe that is called the Bible. Does that make sense? They had not put it into the Bible yet. Okay? But what I'll point out to you is this. Why were there so many citations then? They already regarded it as Scripture. For the early church fathers to quote it as many as 1 million times, they already considered it Scripture. In fact, if you read in the New Testament, there are times when, Paul is talking about, I believe it's the Gospel of Luke, and he refers to even the Gospel of Luke as Scripture. All right? So when was the canon created? The canon was pretty much created and accepted. New Testament works were pretty much accepted as Scripture by the end of the first century. All right? I mentioned to you guys that there are hundreds of thousands of variances within the Scriptures, right? You were talking about contradictions, and I said, okay, well, let's not use the word contradiction. Let's use the word variance, because that's where people like Bart Ehrman will get you. Okay? It's not actual contradictions. They're the vast majority of these variances are vastly irrelevant. And the reading spread, what you're going to realize is that the reading spread through nearly 5,700 manuscripts. That means if one variant spelling with just one letter of one word in one verse in 2,000 manuscripts, guess what it counts as? 2,000 variances. Just the misspelling of one letter in one word. So when you hear people like Bart Ehrman make the quote of, there are more variances in the New Testament than there are words, keep in mind the variances are counting misspellings, even misspellings of one letter in one word. All right? It's realistically, I heard one scholar compare it like this, and if you want to really look up, remember this right here, the movable nu. I can't fully explain it to you because guess what? I don't know Greek. But if you really want to learn it, look up the movable nu, because the movable nu is where the vast majority of your variances are going to come from. All right? And the way one scholar put it is that it's like the difference of using a or an before a word. All right? So you say to yourself, well, then how many of these variances are significant? Textual scholars estimate that only 1 in 60 of these variants has significance. And that comes out to less than 2%. I saw another New Testament scholar at Princeton. He's a professor by the name of Bruce Metzger. He estimates that the New Testament is about 99.5% accurate as far as all of the any kind of translation that would be any kind of significance whatsoever. 99.5% accurate in its translation over 2,000 years. Okay? So as far as the reliability of the New Testament, I would argue that the New Testament is very reliable. Now, as far as the validity of the New Testament, what I would tell you is, and I'll send this on the band app later as well, or I'll send it on tomorrow at some point, is if you want to argue for the validity of the New Testament, I would argue for the 6 E's or 7 E's of evidence. And this was something that was come up by one of the guys that wrote the conversation. There was 2 guys that wrote Conversational Evangelism. It was Norman Geisler and his son David Geisler. The guy that wrote, one of the main people that wrote that book, Norman Geisler, co-wrote a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with another apologist by the name of Frank Turek. Frank Turek is the one who came up with the 7 E's for evidence for the New Testament. And the first E he talks about is the early testimony. The early testimony. So if you want to know if something is valid, how early can you trace it? Not as far as like the time interval is concerned, but how early can you trace it? Like, for example, if I were to write a book right now about Martin Luther King, okay? That would be from 2022 to his death was in 1968, but when we really started to see his relevancy was like in the mid to late 50s, all the way to his death in 68. And so we're looking at, 60 years right there. All right. So what I mean by early testimony is this. When was Jesus crucified? When do we believe Jesus was crucified? You said around 33 AD? Yeah, somewhere between 30 to 33 AD is when Jesus was crucified. When was the vast majority of the New Testament works written? It was before 70 AD. Some people will even date, not that I particularly do, some people will date all of the New Testament before 70 AD. 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Revelation, I date between 90 to 95 AD. Gospel of John is even more, was definitely before, I believe, to be 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. But anyways, the vast majority of the New Testament, okay? Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, all of Pauline, all of Paul's work, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, James I already told you was between 45 to 50, Jude was around 60 something. You know that Peter and Paul's work had to be done before 68 AD, right? Because they were martyred by Emperor Nero. All right? So almost all of the New Testament, the vast majority of the New Testament was completed by 70 AD. And Jesus was crucified in 33 AD, which is putting us around 40 years. All right? You have very early testimony. Not to mention, guys, if you question about any of this, the destruction of the temple in AD 70 would have been mentioned. It would have been mentioned by a lot of these guys. It would have got, like, it was prophesied by Jesus, but it would have been talked about more. Okay? All right. Second, on top of that, we have several eyewitness testimonies. Several eyewitness testimonies. People that were actually there. People that actually saw it. The disciples. People that experienced it. Even if it wasn't the people that necessarily saw the crucifixion and the resurrection and saw all of it, they still experienced a large portion of what happened, because, I mean, even though Saul of Tarsus Paul wasn't one of the disciples, half of the book of Acts is about him, and how much of the New Testament was written by him. Okay? So you have several eyewitness testimony. And eyewitness testimony that can be verified through elaborate testimony. I mentioned to you guys earlier Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and the book of Acts. So Luke volume 1 and Luke volume 2. Alright, so real quick I'll point this out to you. Fun fact. Critics used to believe the book of Acts was historically, some people believe that it was inaccurate. In fact, there was a man named Sir William Ramsay, who's well known to be one of the greatest historical scholars and archaeologists in history. And he decided, like somebody else we know, Lee Strobel, he decided to disprove specifically the book of Acts. Okay, Lee Strobel's going after Christianity as whole. So who did he go after? The Case for Christ, right? Well, Sir William Ramsay is going specifically after one book, the book of Acts. And he wanted to prove that it was historically inaccurate. Okay? But after 30 years of archaeological research in the Middle East, Sir William Ramsay came to the conclusion that Luke, and this is a quote, Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, this author should be placed along with the very greatest historians. And he later wrote a book on the trustworthiness of the Bible based on his discoveries, and he converted to Christianity just by trying to disprove one book. And when he started to go through and find all of the individual things that Luke, the details that Luke poured into the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, is just phenomenal. And it's too much. I could go through here and show you exactly what I'm talking about, but it's just too much. And even if I was to project it onto the board and you'd see what I'm talking about, we'll see how quickly it can take for me to find it. Okay? But it says right here, as you read, classical scholar and historian Colin Hammer chronicles Luke's accuracy in the book of Acts verse by verse. With painstaking detail, Hammer identifies 84 facts alone in the last 16 chapters of Acts that have been confirmed by historical and archaeological research. And as you read the following list, keep in mind that Luke did not have access to modern day maps or nautical charts. And it goes through and it lists 80 some facts, and even showing you the verse that you can find it. Look, it's still going. But if I had to put that and start reading that to you guys, you'd done been asleep if you ain't asleep already. But that's how many details that Luke put in just the book of Acts that have been backed up by archaeological finds, and just from what Sir William Ramsay did when he researched. And when he found out, Luke was right about all of this, down to the very depth of certain waters. Every little detail he was right about. All of the people that were in power during that time that he writes about. Monuments and buildings and all of these different details. They're all right. And this guy goes to prove that he's wrong, converts to Christianity because he finds all these details and it just blows him away. That Dr. Luke did all that. Which, next time when you read Luke chapter 1 and you're reading those first few verses where he's writing to Theophilus and he's telling you about the fact that he's looked through, talked to all the different witnesses, and he's found all the different testimonies, and he's done everything to try to make sure, excellent Theophilus, to try to prove to him, look, this is everything that I found. I want to prove to you that everything I'm saying to you is true history. These are factual evidence. Remember what I just told you right now. Don't skip over it that fast. Because Luke put painstaking detail into the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. All right. So, we see eyewitness testimony, we see elaborate testimony, we see embarrassing testimony. All right. So, what do I mean by embarrassing testimony? Have you guys ever read through the Gospels and you realize how sometimes, I hate to say it like this, you realize the disciples kind of look like, man, how dumb can you be? Or how can you have such little faith? Or how could you do that? Or how could you do this? Or why would you do that? You know, they're the ones writing it. They're the ones writing it. Matthew was one of the disciples. Mark wasn't one of the disciples, but where did Mark get his information from? Peter. He got it from Peter. Luke wasn't one of the disciples, but he mainly got his information from two sources. He got most of it, not just two sources, but two major sources would be the Apostle Paul and the Gospel of Mark, which came from Peter. And then John, who was a disciple. So you see early testimony, you see eyewitness testimony, you see elaborate testimony, you see embarrassing testimony. We see extra biblical testimony. Now, when I'm talking about extra biblical testimony, we've talked about Flavius Josephus, right? Guess what I found out? By the way, Josephus' first name is Flavius. I find it hilarious. So here's the thing about Flavius Josephus. That was not his original name. That is a Roman name that he later on adopted because he's a famous Jewish historian. Why would he have the name Flavius Josephus, right? Essentially, during the Jewish war that Pastor Bill was talking about this morning. Do you remember when he was talking about the Jewish war that led to the destruction of the temple in AD 70? All right. That's when Flavius Josephus surrendered to the Roman Empire. And basically what he just became was a somewhat prophet and also historian for the Roman emperors. Now, with all that being said, he talks about Jesus, and he talks about Jesus supposedly performing very many miracles, and that his disciples believed him to be the Christ. And keep in mind, as he's talking about this, who he's serving. At one point, he's serving Domitian. Well, who's Domitian? He's the Roman emperor that had John boiled. Okay? He's the Roman emperor that banished John to the Isle of Patmos. Okay? And so we also have expected testimony, meaning we have several expected testimony means that we have several prophecies that were fulfilled in Jesus, and we see several prophecies that were fulfilled by Jesus. The temple in AD 70 was one of them that we just mentioned. Alright? Alright. So that takes us through point 6 of the reliability of the New Testament, and as we saw there at the end, the validity of the New Testament. And as far as the New Testament says that Jesus claimed to be God, right? I told you I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time on that, and it's already 7:18, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. But just, if it says it one time, is that good enough in the Bible? So let's go to John 8. If you go to John 8, and read 48 through 59. 58 is going to be the big one. So John 8:48 says, the Jews answered him, are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? Jesus answered, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Yet I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. The Jews said to him, now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets, yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died, and the prophets died? Who do you make yourself out to be? Jesus answered, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say, he is our God. But you have not known him, I know him. If I were to say that I do not know him, I would be a liar like you, but I do know him, and I keep his word. Your fathers, Abraham, rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Now listen here at John 8:58. Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I said to you, before Abraham was, I am. Now, you guys know that right there when he says, I am. He's making the same quote that we read about in Exodus when God is speaking to Moses, right? The I am that I am quote. And then 59 says, so they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. All right? That immediate reaction when he said I am, that immediate reaction to throw stones at him was because he was making a claim to be God. All right? And when you read through the New Testament, you see so many times when they'll always say that he's committing blasphemy because he's claiming to be God. All right, so point 6, the New Testament is historically reliable, and we also see the validity of it. Point 7, the New Testament says Jesus claimed to be God. I can send you guys the Ease on the Band app later. Anything else that you want? Questions, comments, concerns? Coy?
I know that's a lot to digest, like really fast. So like next week, Jamie and I will talk. Next week we may kind of talk through some of this again. That way we don't have a really long night next week. So we'll kind of talk about how we do that. But kind of back to some of the things we talked about early on. We focused on the New Testament with this because it's very important to establish the validity of the New Testament as truth, because of the connection that Jamie made here at the end of Jesus to God. Okay, and that's what's so important. Now, with that said, just so you have some quick couple more thoughts here on the Old Testament, because you guys were asking some questions early on. To give you an idea, I think the estimate is about 17,000 transcripts of the Old Testament that date prior to the 18th century. Okay, so again, in comparison to the Iliad and some of those others, at 1900, you're looking at 17,000. Okay, so very close to the 24,000 you have of the New Testament, which is a relatively newer time frame. The Old Testament is obviously a much larger time frame, a lot more people involved. There have been some huge discoveries of Jewish transcripts through the years that have lended to this. There was a massive one in Cairo. I think it was some 270,000 transcripts that were found. But one of the greatest significant ones that has happened, especially within the last 100 years, is what was found at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, originally it was one cave. They found seven fragments in that cave, of which Isaiah was the biggest part of that. In all, they've put together through the years, now it's 11 caves and over 900 manuscripts that have been found. There are actually portions of every, and maybe I could be wrong, it may not be every, but it's almost every Old Testament book have been found there and have corresponded with all the other transcripts and copies that they have. But Isaiah is still the most significant. They have almost the entire book of Isaiah. And one of particular interest with the Jewish background and everything, Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 is accurate down to the point that there were only 17 letters different from the other copies. So it's a tremendously significant thing there as far as the Old Testament as well, to make that connection. The other thing about the Old Testament, that is also, and we will see this in a few weeks as we continue to develop on this a little bit, and we bring back in some of the miracles and some of the things that happened. Now that we have reliable testimony of what took place with Jesus and in his life and all that, we pull back in some of the miracles, the messianic miracles, and all those things that tie him to the prophecy of the Old Testament. What we see even more of is that Jesus in his word and his quoting of the Old Testament and all those things that he does, he adds even more validity to it as well. So the Old Testament has all this that it stands on, but then you've also got all this New Testament superiority that builds on the Old Testament as well. And that connection of those two is very important, right? Because because there are multiple religions all use the Old Testament as a basis of what their religion would become. Judaism, Christianity, as well as Islam, right? So, you look at all these things and you see that it really begins to pull together a tremendous picture of really the fact that God's done an amazing thing in preservation of the information that we have as truth, so that we can make sound decisions in our life. So that when the Bible says, faith is the substance, evidence and substance. When it talks about those things, we see a lot of reality that comes to that when we see these things. So we'll continue to build on some of these things in the next few weeks. I know there's a lot of information tonight, but there's some pretty cool stuff there to think about. So if you guys have any questions or anything this week, write them down, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk through some of those next week a little bit more.
Send them back out.
Yeah, send them so we kind of have them ahead of time, and then maybe next Sunday night we'll spend a little time digesting it just a little bit more. Okay?